Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 4 very compelling Dogman stories that have some incredibly detailed descriptions of the cryptid. They all seem to coincide with each other, which, at least to me, adds credence to these stories. This is always one thing I look for when researching this topic: consistency in the details, especially when it comes to people describing what they saw. And the 4 stories in this episode from different parts of the country all share similarities with one another. Alright, let's get to the first story. The first story of this episode takes place in Danbury, Wisconsin. Danbury is located in the northwest part of the state, just shy of the Wisconsin-Minnesota border. According to the 2010 census, it has a population of only 172. It covers a total area of just 1.2 square miles. Wisconsin is no stranger to Dogman sightings, as the area where the famous Beast of Bray Road sightings took place and continue to take place is also located in the state. The original poster, or OP, describes himself as standing 6'4" and being athletic. He is an avid hunter, camper, and practices martial arts. He sums it all up into one word: survivalist. He also states that he was naive and cocky, not respecting nature the way he should have, and he felt invincible, as most headstrong teenagers do. At the time of the encounter, he was 16 or 17 years old. His family owned a cabin on Long Lake in Danbury. The land surrounding the lake is covered in forests, other than a few sparse areas. He was at the cabin with his family, and he and his cousin decided to play airsoft, as he puts it. For those of you who don't know, airsoft guns shoot plastic pellets and, like paintball, are designed to be shot at other people. These guns are powered by batteries similar to that of RC cars. The pellets can sting, and it is recommended that you wear protective clothing, just like in paintball. So the boys set out to play airsoft. The OP decked out in his BDU woodland attire and a camo mask, while his cousin wore jeans and a t-shirt. The quote, battle, as he puts it, took them into the woods about 150 meters. When the battle ended in a clearing, our OP decided to have a little fun with his cousin, shushing him and telling him that they were being watched. It, of course, was a joke. At the time, it soon became very real. It was then that he noticed that an unnatural stillness had come over the woods. There was absolutely no noise around them. He knew this only happened when there was a large predator in the area. His guard went up almost immediately, and then he felt it. Eyes were on him. He scanned the woods and stopped when he saw white teeth on the edge of the clearing, approximately 40 meters away. Whatever was behind the teeth was crouched and had its arm wrapped around a tree. Its dog-like head was aimed directly at them, this thing panting while watching them with its ears up. It had reddish-brown fur and definitely looked canine. He also said it was very muscular, as big as a bodybuilder. The first thought to go through his mind was that he was looking at a werewolf. He told his cousin it was time to go, and his cousin immediately took off running. He must have felt something too. The OP stood there, his eyes locked on this beast as it began to charge, running on 2 legs for about 10 feet before dropping down on all 4s. That's when he turned and started running. He could hear the Dogman crashing through the trees behind him as he ran. This continued the entire way out of the woods. They eventually made it back to the cabin unharmed and talked about what they saw. He still doesn't know if his cousin saw it, so he told him it was a bear because he didn't want to freak him out. But he knows his bears, and this thing was not a bear. He also believes it charged them in an act of guarding its territory. He started doing some research on what he saw and eventually came across some Dogman sites. What others described encountering is exactly what he saw that day. He still goes into the forests, but he is always armed when he does and is very respectful of nature. He is extremely cautious and prefers not to go alone. When he describes it as charging them as a way of guarding its territory, that is something a lot of people feel when they encounter these beings. And as I've mentioned in other episodes, people talk about being chased out of the woods with these creatures either behind them or just inside the tree line beside them, almost as if they are being escorted out of the woods by whatever is chasing them. Still, the experience must have been terrifying, because in that moment when you feel like you're running for your life, and you very well could be, you don't know what the intent of this creature is. Those boys did the right thing by getting out of there as fast as they could. The next story takes place in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a town named Cedarville. Cedarville is a civil township that has a population of 276 as of the 2000 census. The town is a part of the Great Waters of the Upper Peninsula and has a total area of 79.1 square miles, or 205 kilometers. It is part of the Escanaba State Forest. Like Wisconsin in the first story, Michigan is no stranger to Dogman stories either, with a lot of the posts and stories I hear coming from this state. The original poster was in Michigan with her husband staying on family property deep in the woods, where the only clear area was the big front yard. Everything else, including the driveway, was heavily forested. It was the first day of hunting season in November of 2013 at around 11 o'clock at night. There were lights on the porch that lit some of the yard, but beyond that, it was nearly too dark to see anything at all. The OP and her husband had gone outside to smoke a cigarette. They always had a rifle on them while outside due to bears in the area. She was standing on the front porch and her husband had walked down into the yard where he stood facing her. Everything was normal and fine until they heard very heavy, slow footsteps coming through the woods, walking down the driveway toward them. She describes the footsteps as sounding like a huge man, but heavier than anything she has ever heard walk, including an adult bear. If this wasn't weird enough, the footfalls were accompanied by heavy breathing. Her husband, who isn't a hunter, looked at her as if to say WTF, while she was trying to figure out what exactly was coming up the driveway. Confused, she simply shook her head in response. She has hunted and tracked every kind of animal indigenous to northern Michigan and could think of nothing she had heard in all her years on the property that matched the gait and breathing of what was out there. What walked out of the tree line behind her husband dwarfed him. She estimated that it was at least 7 feet tall and had to have weighed about 400 pounds. It was bipedal and had extremely dark black fur, blacker even, she says, than the night. The beast stalked back and forth just outside the porch light's reach throughout the duration of the encounter. This made it difficult for the OP to make out much of the cryptid, but she could see a wolf-like head and snout, as well as pointed ears on top of its head that stuck straight up. It had elongated arms and very large hands. She started to freak out at this point and grabbed the rifle as the beast continued to skulk back and forth in front of her and her husband. She started shooting and yelling at her husband to get on the porch. He did so and took the gun from her, instructing her to go inside and find something else to use as a weapon and hide. So that's exactly what she did. She ran inside, grabbed a big knife, and locked herself in the bedroom closet. She stood there for about 10 minutes listening to her husband shoot, reload, and shoot, repeating the process numerous times. He eventually came inside and told her the Dogman had finally run off. She refused to leave the closet until the sun came up. Her husband stood guard by the door, armed with his rifle. Despite him telling her he thought she had hit the beast when she shot at it, they found no evidence of it the next day. There was no blood or fur anywhere to be seen in the area where the encounter took place. Something that stood out to her during the night's events was how agile and fast this creature was. There was also no evidence of it running through the trees, as none of the foliage had been disturbed when it fled. Her husband told her when he was shooting at it, the thing dropped down on all fours a few times as it ran back and forth. Then, when it finally fled, it ran away with inhuman speed on 2 legs. However, they saw no footprints from where this Dogman had run through their yard or walked up the driveway. They later talked to the neighbor and he told the couple he saw it too the winter before. He and his wife were throwing a party at their hunting cabin when he heard heavy footsteps on the porch. Wondering who or what it could be, he walked over and looked out the window to find a Dogman standing there looking down at him. Except its fur was white. The OP guesses that's because of the snow. Perhaps it was a different Dogman. I've never heard of one with white fur though, so maybe she's right. Everyone at the party, in their panic, decided to run through the woods to his mother's house because it was a lot sturdier than the hunting cabin. She says she's known that neighbor very well for a number of years since she was in high school, and he would not lie about something like that. She could even tell how scared he was while telling her the story. While researching the topic, she discovered that a family 45 miles north of where she had her encounter had a bunch of livestock killed, having been ripped to shreds by a big predator. One of the family members recalls seeing a giant upright wolf while in his hunting blind during deer season. She also found encounters with a supposed pack of 4 or 5 in a state forest in the southern part of Michigan, as well as sightings all over. Imagine standing outside in the dark and hearing heavy footsteps coming up the driveway through the woods accompanied by heavy breathing. Reading that part of the story sent a chill down my spine. That must have been truly terrifying. Something that stuck out to me while reading this story was her description of the fur. In so many stories, Dogman fur is described as being blacker than the night. These beings are described as having fur so black that it stands out from the night and the darkness around it. Another thing that sticks out to me about this story is how it stayed just out of the light's reach. This is something that happens in a lot of the stories I read and hear, especially with Dogman and Sasquatch. As for the shooting at it, I've heard this is the worst thing you can do, as it does little to no damage and it just makes them mad. The only story I've heard where one was killed, it was shot through the eye. I'm willing to bet most people who encounter these creatures aren't that good of a shot, much less under extreme duress and while panicking. The best thing you can do is get out of there in a hurry. The next story takes place in Wise River, Montana, where a man encountered a Dogman in his yard. Wise River is located in southwest Montana and is surrounded by 500,000 acres of mountain peaks, lakes, and headwaters in the Pioneer Mountains. Visitors to the area often enjoy scenic views, camping, hiking, fishing, ghost towns, and crystal digging during the summer, and snowmobiling and cross-country skiing in the winter. The original poster's encounter took place during the summer of 2015 at approximately 11:30 p.m. He lived alone in a remote location in Wise River and was relaxing and watching TV on the night he would witness a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. He had no choice but to have satellite TV because cable wasn't offered where he lived. Well, the TV started to mess up, so he ventured outside with his flashlight and the semi-automatic rifle he had purchased due to his other sightings. During these experiences, he describes his surroundings as being so silent that it was unnerving, but he never saw anything that could point to a Dogman. However, what he experienced was enough to make him want to purchase a firearm just in case. So he set off to the corner of his yard to adjust his satellite dish and went to work, checking the wires and turning it at a different angle when he heard a stick snap off to his left. What he saw sent him running for his house, but not before he got a good look at this being. He stared at the creature for about 10 seconds, but says it felt more like an eternity. The first thing he noticed was this thing's head, which had cropped ears that pointed straight up. Its snout was narrow and long, unlike the short, broad snout of a bear, and it had large teeth sticking out of its mouth. The next thing he noticed was this thing's eyes, which were a deep red that reflected the light from his flashlight. The creature's body was huge and muscular and had arms that looked to be longer than its legs. It had broad shoulders, a thin waist, and had thick black fur around its neck and on its chest. It stood slightly crouched, and he guessed it was around 6 feet tall in its current position. But if it stood at its full height, it would have easily been at least 7.5 feet tall. He's unsure if the creature he saw was aggressive or not, but the feeling of dread that came over him while in its presence was unlike anything he had ever felt. He wonders if it was stalking him or just observing him, but one unsettling thing he mentions about the beast was that it was so silent that it got within 15 feet from him without him noticing. In that moment, when he saw this thing, he knew he needed to get out of there, and do so in a hurry. So that's exactly what he did, retreating into his house and locking all the doors and windows. He didn't have another face-to-face encounter with this creature, but he would hear things off in the distance from time to time. The unexplainable howls and screams he heard would start off quiet, but then grow louder and more furious before dying back down again. He does say it could have been local wildlife, but he could not help but think back to this creature when he heard the noises. He has since moved from the property. In pretty much all the stories I read about cryptid encounters, the posters always talk about the feeling of dread that comes over them, and how it is unlike anything they have ever experienced. I couldn't even begin to try and imagine the terror they feel in those moments when they are standing face to face with a creature thought to be mythical or just existing in scary stories, only to find out that they are indeed real. It's hard to say what any of us would do in that situation, but I think he did the right thing by getting out of there. I mentioned in the last story that it isn't a good idea to shoot at these things, so it's probably good that he didn't. I'm glad he didn't have to witness this thing again, but this one and only encounter had a lasting effect. I don't know if he moved from the property because of the Dogman, but I don't think I would have stayed there either. The final story of this episode comes from Northeast Pennsylvania. The original poster doesn't give an exact location, but does say he lives in a neighborhood that faces a major highway and backs up to state game lands. He sees wildlife every now and then, including turkeys, deer, and skunks. However, he mentioned that there is no smaller game in the area, such as squirrels, groundhogs, or chipmunks, which he finds odd. His home isn't far from downtown, so his location isn't exactly rural, but that didn't stop the creature he saw one night from entering his neighborhood and taking a particular interest in him and his home. His encounter took place in January of 2019, when he noticed a large animal in his driveway, head to the ground sniffing. The animal he assumed at first glance was a bear, moved its head side to side as it casually moved up his driveway, walking on all fours. He was watching it from the window that overlooks the driveway, but the driveway is partially obscured from this view. He watched the assumed bear walk toward the street with its head still lowered to the ground sniffing. This is when the OP moved from his living room to the window in his bedroom, which has a full view of the street, to get a better look. He sees the bear again, but something seems off about it. He realizes that it isn't a bear when it stands up on its hind legs and walks out into the street. He noticed this thing's pointed ears and long snout as it raised its head to sniff the air. He got his best look at it when it moved under a streetlight. The creature's fur was either dark gray or black, but it was hard to tell which due to the yellow light from the streetlight skewing the color. He confirmed its high pointed ears and long snout under the light, but never saw its teeth. Its arms were bent and its hands, which hung limp-wristed, had long claws. If the arms had been fully extended, its hands would have hung down past its knees. It stood approximately 7 to 7.5 feet tall and was heavily muscled with a slim waist. When it stood up on its hind legs, it did so naturally and in one fluid motion before walking across the street and stooping down in some thick scrub brush. That's when he saw this thing's glowing blue eyes looking directly at him. He isn't sure if the reflected light caused them to appear as if they were glowing or if they were glowing on their own. But when the creature made eye contact with him, panic set in and his legs gave way. He dropped down to a sitting position under his big picture window. He was home alone with his 5 cats and dog, all of which were asleep for the duration of the sighting. He felt like there was nothing stopping this beast from getting him if it wanted to. He got on his knees and slowly rose to peek out the window, but he didn't see anything. He scanned the area, but the creature was gone. He mentions that he did not feel as if this creature was aggressive or angry as it looked at him, even though looking at this thing terrified him. it didn't seem to be mad that it had been seen either, as he has heard other people say in their stories. He says he didn't even think about taking a picture because the thought didn't even cross his mind while he stood staring at this beast in a state of shock. Snapping a picture was the last thing on his mind at the time. Since he saw the creature, he has heard odd sounds around his home, tapping on his windows, and scratching along the side of his house. He no longer sees any animals around the neighborhood either, including about 7 stray cats he used to feed. He installed motion sensor lights and 2 game cameras, even though he hopes, like Sasquatch seemed to do, it avoids the cameras. He never wants to see this creature again. He goes on to warn those who want to have a Dogman encounter, saying that he still hasn't gotten a full night's sleep since his sighting, and every noise after dark scares the heck out of him. He lives alone and doesn't feel like his 357 would do any good against this creature. He does give an update to one user who asked for one in the comments, saying that he still catches quick glimpses of the creature and has caught it looking in his windows on several occasions. However, he doesn't fear the Dogman like he once did. This is because he feels it seems content just watching him. It hasn't been aggressive toward him at all and seems to just like lurking around his home and peeking in his windows every now and then. He caught it looking in his laundry room window, but it ran off when he walked in. He finds its behavior baffling. As I mentioned in the intro, his description of the Dogman he saw lines up with the other stories from this episode. When these creatures are described the same way by different people who live in completely different parts of the country and/or world, it only adds credibility to their stories for me. I just don't see how complete strangers can make up the same details, sometimes the exact same details. It would take a lot of time and effort to come online, research stories, and then completely fabricate one that sounds realistic. I pass over a lot of stories that sound so ridiculously fake, and the ones that are believable to me that I include in these episodes are ones that contain consistent details like these 4 stories do. As for what he describes with the Dogman hanging around, tapping on and looking in his windows, and scratching at the side of his house, these are also common components I hear in a lot of these stories. Even though it isn't acting aggressively, yet, it does seem to like to torment him. I wonder why that is. I've heard they enjoy instilling fear in people, and my only guess is when this thing saw him watching it through the window and his reaction of fear when it made eye contact with him, the creature wanted to do that more. The OP does mention that he isn't as afraid of this thing as he was the first time he saw it. Who knows, maybe this creature will eventually realize this and move on. This is all purely speculation, of course. I hope for his sake it does lose interest and leaves him alone. As for the animals in the area, especially the 7 or so stray cats, I hope they sensed this thing and moved on, rather than the alternative I know we are all thinking. And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.